So I want us to talk about the classes. So according to classes are actually a blueprint. So blueprint is just remember that is a simulation, and they simulate actually like a real problem or a real task or maybe like a real object. So they simulate maybe like I'm just going to call it real world objects. So remember that classes is a blueprint and they do something. They simulate a real world object. So and in these objects remember they also have attributes. So remember objects like maybe like a car. A car, of course, maybe will have a speed, then also the model, and maybe the number of wheels. So those are all the attributes, and the class itself will now be the car. So I want you to first get to understand that, so that when we want to like directly look at its architecture, so remember that classes, and the good thing about classes in C++ programming is they can actually be like created under the same file. So unlike other maybe programming languages, so let us first look at the architecture of a class. So it uses the keyword class. So class is just a keyword, and remember that keywords are predefined variables, but not variables but words that cannot be used apart maybe for variables naming. So we have a class, then we have the class name, and I want you to note something here. With the class name, the naming always starts with a capital letter. So when you want to create a class, just make sure that you have this keyword and you have this class name, and the class name should always at any case start with a capital letter. Then of course you have to have the opening and the closing curly brackets, and remember that you end your class with a semicolon. So what now comes here in between are now like the attributes. So what you can do is you can maybe like start declaring. So maybe you have to declare attributes. So attributes, of which these attributes include, so maybe like we are dealing with a class of animals, so we can maybe declare attributes such as maybe the number of legs, what the animal produces, or the animal name. So attributes defined more, so it gives us a clear definition of what that class is. So you can also have private, something private. So when things are private here, this means that it can only be accessed within the class, and no other method can actually access the attributes. So when you want to use the private way of your attributes, so remember again, private is a keyword. So when you want to use this private, so when you use private, you are telling your class that, hey, no other method like the methods in between these. So I cannot access, maybe like if I have a different method here, so method of the class above, this method won't be able to access the attributes here, because we are telling the compiler that this should be private and it will only be accessed. Methods within this class will only access this code. So the next thing is you can maybe like decide to make your attributes public, so it can be accessed actually outside the class. So what you are trying to actually tell the compiler here is you are telling it that methods here can access, these methods can access my class because it's now public. So this is actually a basic way of creating a class. So again, one thing to remember is like just like we created like the functions, so classes also must be called. So let's say we have this class name, so you must create an instance of the class. So that's an instance of an object, so you have to do that. So maybe like let me just call it temp. So this is called like instantiation. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to instantiate this. So we're creating an instance of this class by creating this object. So what we are trying to do here is we are making it accessible from this. So from here now, then I can have maybe like attributes like maybe dot, maybe like, so let's then maybe I give it an integer of 40. So let's say I add an attribute called int legs. So for the maybe like the animals. So for me to access this number of legs, and then I have to use the dot one to access and give it a value, so that in case I want to print it out, then I can just directly see out the what it is inside this class. And remember that again, classes are like very much reusable. So I can say I can have another different one, so like name, then now like maybe name2. So these are different one. Then I can now say name2 dot legs, then give it maybe this one now as a leg 50 legs. So this is like one of the awesome part of classes. So it makes classes like reusable. So instead of rewriting all these code above here, then you can always reuse them. So let's actually get to look into a quick example. So I'm going to call this one class animals, so that it makes it like more easier to explain. So animals. Then I'm going to have maybe different attributes into name, not actually name, so maybe length. Then maybe I can say string, maybe like let's say we have wild animals and domestic animals, so we just say string type. Then let's have a boolean, so boolean, so maybe like production. Let's just have a string, so let's say string which products should they produce as maybe. So these are all my attributes, and to make sure that these attributes are accessible outside this, I'm going to make them public. So I'm going to say now come here above, so I make sure that I have this public. Then I'm going to select this, then use a tab to perform indentation. So this means that these attributes are actually accessible outside this class. So I can now come and create an instance of these animals. So I can now say animals, then give it a variable name. So let me call this one wild animals. Then I'm going to say here, I'm now going to call my variable wild animals, then dot. So you see now that when I place the dot, then it gives me these variables here. So I have variable int legs string name. So let me go with first int legs. So now let me assign maybe like I have the animal has 4 legs. Then I'm going to say all animals dot. Now let me production. So let's say this one produces milk. So let's say that's a cow. Then wild animals again, the dot, the type now. So for the type, let me just say this is a domestic animal. Now when I print this, so to print out this, I'm going to say cout, then I'm going to say wild animals. So let's say I want to access the legs, then me just do that in a new line. So when I now run this, I expect that my code would work, compile, and then print here. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm calling this variable. And remember, this variable is an instance of this object, and this object is actually like a class on its own, which has these attributes. And these attributes, I started by initializing it to maybe a default one, that's the int legs. Now when I run it, so let's see what will happen. You see now that we have 4. So let's say we want to now maybe like access let's say the production here. So let's say we want to see what it produces. So we now see that it produces the milk. Now we can reuse this same class. So I'm going to create another instance here, animals, then let's say domestic. So then I can now say domestic. So let me just copy it so it can a little bit be easier. I'm just going to say domestic dot maybe legs. So let's say I'm talking of a kangaroo here. Oh, I'm just confusing. So this will be like domestic because a cow is a domestic, but just for use cases here. Then the type. So the type is maybe like a wild animal. And then also let's check now on the production. So it produces, let's say, okay, what does maybe like a kangaroo? Let's say tourist. Now it attracts tourists, but it does not produce tourists. Okay. Now once I'm done with this, let me run. I can now access them. So I'm just going to say cout. So we have domestic dot maybe like let's say it produces, so that we can now see the difference here, that to make sure that it's actually like reusable. So when I run my code here, okay, sorry, so see out, I now run this, then we see now the cow produces milk and the kangaroo produces tourists. Of course, we are not, so we now say we want to now print out maybe like the legs, and then also want to print the legs. If I now run this, then we expect that we're going to see 4 and 2 depending on how we reused our classes. So that's all about the basic architecture of a class. So the next thing I want us to check on is let's get to understand how we are going to implement to make the class more a little bit like reusable, and to take maybe a little more over arguments and parameters. So let's get to understand what constructors like do in a class.